Hi everyone, Susan here with the Sacramento History Museum. We're about to get started on this week's Museum Monday. Our topic is SacraTomatos. I'm going to hold off for just a few seconds here to double check that my sound is working. So if you wouldn't mind giving me a thumbs up in the comments or something like that, just so I can confirm that the sound is good before I get 10 minutes in. And I don't want you to miss any of my excellent information about this. I also wanted to let you know I am in the museum today because we have a wonderful agriculture gallery in the museum, and since we'll be talking about agriculture, I want to use some of the things we have here. So if there is, and we are open to the public, so if there is a member of the public who comes into the museum, I will be putting my mask back on to keep everyone safe. So if you see me with my mask on, that is why. All right, and I got the thumbs up. Wonderful, our sound is working. That's a good start. So once again, thank you everybody. Today's Museum Monday is all about kind of California nicknames, but specifically about agriculture. If you know some of the nicknames that Sacramento has, I think I just said California nicknames, but we're talking about Sacramento nicknames, please feel free to put some in the comments. I would also, if you have any questions or anything, please put it in the comments, and I would be happy to answer them maybe on air or afterwards too, once we kind of have the footage there. So some of the different nicknames that Sacramento has, maybe you're familiar with America's Farm to Fork Capital. That's a big one, especially this week or last week, because we're kind of celebrating food in the month of September. We're also known as the City of Trees. That one is a personal favorite of mine. We're known as Camellia City. We're known as the Big Tomato. Yes, you may have heard of the Big Apple, but we are the Big Tomato. And then, of course, SacraTomatos. Now, when I first heard that, I moved to Sacramento about 6 years ago, and when I first heard SacraTomatos, I thought it was the silliest thing I've ever heard, and it wasn't until recently when I started researching for this that I actually understand where this all comes from and why it has that nickname and why it's not as silly as you might think. It's something that Sacramentans should actually just embrace and be a part of. So we are going to go back a little bit further before Sacramento was known as SacraTomato and talk about kind of the roots of this and why agriculture is like such a big deal for Sacramento and the Sacramento Delta and the Valley and everything like that. So you see that agriculture is really kind of the second gold rush for the Sacramento area, and it's kind of a big deal, maybe even a bigger deal than the first gold rush. I'm willing to be wrong about that, but I think it might be. See, during the first gold rush, there wasn't any like big farming enterprises or like agricultural things around Sacramento at that time when the first gold rush happened. Now John Sutter, he did have a farm. He had quite a big enterprise actually, but when those thousands of people came in, it wasn't enough to feed everybody. And there was quite a few smaller farmers and people who had arrived in the 1840s here in Sacramento, and they kind of did more what would be called subsistence farming. They had a garden or a small farm that took care of their family, but wasn't really designed for anything beyond that. So when thousands upon thousands of people arrived here for the gold rush, there just wasn't any fresh food to be had. And what that meant, that all the food was coming from a lot of different places. So if you ever come to the museum, be sure to check out our really cool timeline here, okay? And this panel here, the gold rush grub, kind of highlights what was going on during the gold rush and where this food came from. So I wanted to point out a few kind of interesting, cool facts, I think, that if you were living here or if you came to Sacramento and then were moving on toward the gold fields, your food was coming from all sorts of different places. You wanted flour, you would probably get it from Oregon. Now, John Sutter did have the very first grist mill, which is what would have ground down the wheat into flour, but it was kind of crude. It wasn't the best grist mill, and so it didn't have enough to feed everybody. Beans from Chile, rice, China, beef jerky, Argentina. So the food was coming from all over the place. And once it was getting here, it was probably kind of old, but also once it got here by ship, it was, what you had. And so the prices of these things were very, very high because you just had to wait till the next ship for hopefully more food. So here's another kind of price comparison on how much food was going for during the gold rush compared to today. So beef, for example, $10 a pound in 1851. That's $330 per pound. Some of the other kind of crazy ones, cheese, $25 a pound. That's $825. Oranges were 15 cents each, or $8.25 each. Eggs, that's one that we really like to point out, $3 per egg. That's $97 per egg. Not worth it, right? Unless you are really, really just craving an egg. So that's kind of what was going on at that time. And when a lot of people arrived here for the gold rush and didn't have much luck actually mining for gold, they might have been farmers in their past life, in their life before coming out to California, and they kind of realized, maybe there's something to be had more in that aspect of it. And so they turned back to what they did before. They turned back to farming and had a lot more success with that instead of actually looking for gold, which is kind of a common story. And hence that kind of kicks off the second gold rush, the agriculture gold rush. Now, there's two people I really want to highlight here who did that exact thing, who were farmers or were horticulturists or had some sort of botany background. And then when they came to California for the gold rush and realized that gold was actually pretty difficult to find, they went back to that. The first one is Anthony Preston Smith. You might find him as A.P. Smith in a lot of things. I found this really wonderful news article. I meant to print it off to show you, and I forgot. It was just like this little blurb, and it said that Anthony Preston Smith brought cucumbers to the Sacramento Bee today. I just thought that was so cute. Like, that made it into the newspaper. That was newsworthy that he brought them cucumbers that day. How sweet is that? Now, A.P. Smith, he sailed around Cape Horn. And the legend goes that while he was sailing around Cape Horn, he did a lot of gambling games, as you would on a very long boat ride like that, and he won a lot of money. In fact, he won $5,000, and that is what he ended up paying John Sutter when he got here, or eventually after he got here, for 50 acres of land. He paid $5,000 for 50 acres of land that he bought from John Sutter, and he started his own garden, nursery, that sort of thing. So he began farming vegetables, and he opened up a garden nursery, and eventually he added fruit and flowers and timber and all sorts of different things. They say that he was the first to introduce the raisin to California, which California raisins are kind of famous, kind of popular. There's a lot of debate on whether or not, that was a good thing, because raisins are blech, but that's okay. He was also the first to use irrigation, which is, for technology at the time was a really big deal. Now, in 1854, let me check that actually, 1854, his harvest was eaten by grasshoppers, and he had a really hard time, but he recovered from that, and the 3 years after that, he actually made about $40,000 in profits, which over 3 years, that would be in today's money about $2 million. So, I mean, that's significant. Like, these people are doing really well. Now, unfortunately, however, for A.P. Smith, in 1861 to 1862, there was a terrible flood in Sacramento. Perhaps you've heard of it, and if you haven't, you should look back at some of these old videos that we've done, because we talk about that flood quite a bit. It changed a lot. And his fields were decimated by it, actually swept away his family home, and he just never fully recovered after that. So that's kind of the height and everything for A.P. Smith, but he was really well known at the time. And he also knew the next gentleman I want to talk about briefly, James L. Lafayette Franklin Warren. And I have to make sure I have that all in order, because it is quite the names, James L. Lafayette Franklin Warren. This is a very famous gentleman. We're going to be talking more about him next week, but he opened the New England Seed Store, where in 1852, he sponsored an exposition, if you will, where you could bring in your different nursery products and minerals, and he offered prizes to the best ones. What does that sound like? It's almost like he would offer a blue ribbon if it's the best one he has. This was actually eventually what became the state fair, and that's our topic for next week, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But I do have a picture here of what his New England Seed Store looked like that I wanted you to see. because where I'm standing here at the Sacramento History Museum, it would have stood really, really nearby. In fact, it would have been on J Street and the corner where the Firehouse Alley is, so not far away at all. And if you're ever down in Old Sacramento, there's actually a plaque there that talks about him. So be sure to check that out because it's kind of cool. Now, James L. also introduced the camellia flower to Sacramento. Perhaps you remember I said that was one of our nicknames, the camellia. And he came from Boston, and he actually introduced the tomato to Boston, which is crazy that this happened kind of later than you would expect tomatoes to have been introduced to, like the East Coast. So that kind of brings us back to the nickname I really want to talk about. We get to finally talk about the big tomato, or SacraTomatos, or SacraTomatos. And that brings us down the timeline a little bit further to this panel here. Can it? Now, yes, Sacramento had a ton of produce and production of tomatoes, of the fruit itself, but the nickname doesn't come from that. It actually comes from the canning and the canneries that we had specifically for tomatoes, although we canned a lot of different produce and items. So I like to, if you live in Sacramento, you definitely know this, but driving around Sacramento this time of year, you see a lot of these open trucks that have two beds, and they're really large, and they're just heaping full of tomatoes. And then if you're going on the on and off ramps, you just see these tomatoes splattered left and right on the ramps, and it's just kind of a funny time of year in Sacramento where you're like, oh yeah, there's the tomatoes again. So like I said, our rich soil allows for just a huge variety of crops to grow in the Sacramento Delta and the Valley, which kind of means that this is a really good place, or Sacramento is a really good place not just to grow the food, but also to start transporting the food, because we're on a river. And by especially the 1900s and whatnot, we had an excellent railway, and we're kind of a crossroads. So we really just had it all kind of going for us as far as production and transportation and whatnot. So I wanted to, well, maybe let's get back to this. Let's go this way, and we'll kind of end back over there. Because we can, like I said, all sorts of food, and if you can look up, you can see that we have a canning line here. Maybe it will come closer, yeah. Now, the canning line is actually, it's not a tomato canning line. This is a prototype from the Blue Diamond Almond Factory that I think they made it specifically for the museum when the museum opened. But we're not, it's from the Blue Diamond Almond Factory, and Sacramento is, we're not known as the almond capital of the world, so we're not going to talk about that. Just kidding, we are known as the almond capital of the world. So you can add that to the list of all of Sacramento's nicknames, of which it just keeps getting longer and longer. Maybe if you want to put your favorite nickname in the comments, that would make me very happy, and then I can see them all. So canning, though, also it allows fruit to last a lot longer. It's a lot easier and it's a lot cheaper to do than dehydrating fruit, for example. So canning actually lets that process go a lot longer, and the food has a lot more time to get to other places in the country to feed people. So that's kind of why canning really started to take over in the 1900s. I wanted to show you here too just some of the things that we have. It really goes to show you how important canning was for this area. So Sacramento, it took advantage of how good canning was for the food to get to other places. And in the 1920s, two of the largest canneries in the world actually opened up here in Sacramento. The first was Libby Smith and Libby. Libby McNeil. I got A.P. Smith mixed up. Libby McNeil and Libby, and he had a cannery that was located at R and 31st Streets, which it still exists today. It's not a cannery anymore. In fact, though, if you drive by it, it's in East Sacramento, not too far off Alhambra. It's still called the cannery, but I think there's a California Fitness and different office buildings there at the time, but the building is original. The other very large cannery that existed at the time was the California Packing Company, or CalPac. Eventually that became known as the Del Monte Corporation, and I can show you here a lot of these have the Del Monte like brand on it, and that is what they were most known for. So like this one is pears, but I know like here's Del Monte tomato sauce, and I was kind of looking at this earlier to see all of them. One of my favorites was this Gold Dust tomato with puree from Trimmy. I was like, what? That's cool. I just like the name. I think it's kind of fun. But the Del Monte Corporation, one of their buildings was located at 17th and C Streets, which again, if you're from California and you think 17th and C, there is something there. And there is. That cannery eventually became the Blue Diamond Almond Cannery, still there today. However, I will say that the CalPac or Del Monte Corporation, they actually owned 4 separate Sacramento canneries. So that was just one of them, and they had quite a few of them. So they, though, canned not just tomatoes. They canned a lot of different fruits, but the largest tomato product producer that was here in California was the Bear Cut Richards Packing Company, and they distributed under the Sacramento brand, so it's kind of cool. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention Campbell Soup. Campbell Soup opened up a company here, and they had their tomato soup that was made here. I guess even you could kind of like smell it on certain days when you're walking around Sacramento and could smell the tomato soup in the air. They were kind of the last major canning company that opened in Sacramento, and that was in 1947. And they actually didn't close their doors until 2013. And they were a huge employer in the area too. So kind of cool. Now, conditions in these factories, though, I do want to mention, was really difficult. Let's walk this way briefly, and we'll go back to the timeline. If you've ever done any canning of your own at home, you know that canning is not the easiest thing to do. It is hard work, and it gets hot. And in our sort of 1920s and 1930s kitchen here, we show these different things or the different process of canning here. So it is something that you can do at home. But if you can imagine how big of an operation it is when you're just doing it at home, now imagine it at a corporate scale. And that's kind of the working conditions that a lot of the people in the canneries had to deal with. So it's hot and it's hard work, and it can be quite seasonal too, although as time went on, people in Sacramento were able to kind of have different growing seasons, or they were encouraged to, because canning allowed you to do it year round. So also kind of cool. So pretty much all of these canneries shut down. Which one? Oh, we're going to go over here. Or no, actually, let's go back to can it. Sorry. I want to show you real quick here too. Here's one, women workers at the Sacramento Del Monte Canning Factory in 1925. Just look at that production. I mean, it's incredible. Look at them all. It's literally as far as the eye can see. So yeah, kind of a big deal there. Now, most of the canning things did shut down in the 1980s, and then they became repurposed. These are enormous buildings. Not all of them survived, but they kind of became repurposed to other things. And there's a lot of reasons why canning sort of stopped. Like I said, it's tough work. And as time went on, the mechanics behind it got easier, and they didn't have to hire as many people to do the canning because they used actual machines and different things. And then also, there was a new fad, right? People now preferred frozen food, and that was actually one of the big reasons. If you think of the 1980s, that's really when it started. It's back on here. We'll sneak down here. And so frozen foods kind of went up, canning products kind of went down, and that, along with the mechanization of it all, meant that a lot of these canneries closed. So it's okay. Now, I do want to come back, though, to kind of conclude these things with the most recent nickname for Sacramento, which earned this nickname in 2017, and that's America's Farm to Fork Capital. And it is, I believe that's what we're celebrating this month, or this week even. And so I did want to finish with that. There's kind of this push to go back to, eat locally and go back to the roots, and don't focus on, get fresh food, don't focus on the frozen food or on the canned food. And that's where this farm to fork thing really goes. And it's really where Sacramento excels, because a lot of the food that we would eat, it comes from here. We ship it off to a lot of different places, but Sacramento has an incredible ability to grow and to have this here. So, that is where we are today, but I always like to know, like, here we are, we just walked down this entire timeline here, and I'm just curious, maybe, like, what comes next now, right? So if you want to put down in your comments, where do you think we're going to go next? We've kind of, we've gone from things that were really hard to get, like that had to ship here for the gold rush, and then we realized that in this area, in particular in Sacramento, we have incredible soil where we can grow almost anything, and so we do that, and we have such an abundance of it that we decide to start canning it, and that rises up, and then, you know, all these sort of different fads come in, and then we kind of come back, though, away from the canning, away from the frozen and into the fresh. So I don't know where it goes from here exactly, but I'd like to hear what you think. Where's the food fads, if you will, going to go from here? Now, next week we're going to continue on in this theme of agriculture and food and what it means to Sacramento. We're going to be talking more about the state fair. So I hope you can all join us next week when we talk about that. It's very, very fun, and there's like a really cool history there that might surprise you. So thank you for joining me, everybody, and hope to see you next week.